Welcome back to The Explainer. Okay, let's just dive right into this. Today, we're taking a really hard look at a concept most of us hear every single day. And frankly, it's a concept most of us just assume we completely understand: liberal democracy. But what if I told you that the political system governing so much of the modern world is actually built on a massive, ancient, and highly unstable paradox? Well, it is. We're going to completely deconstruct the sources, the history, and the philosophy to reveal the hidden mechanics of how power actually operates.
Here is our roadmap for today. We'll start with Plato's ancient warnings, unpack the arranged marriage between liberalism and democracy, look at the U.S. as a test case, explore a controversial historical critique of its founding, and finally, bring the whole shebang into the present with money, gridlock, and modern geopolitics. Let's get started.
All right, Section 1. Plato versus modern democracy, the ancient critique.
To truly get a handle on this, we have to start by looking at a high-stakes modern debate over governance, specifically the contrast between Western systems and the so-called China model. Philosopher Dongxiang Zhang perfectly captures the modern realist defense of democracy here. He's actively challenging the idea that a one-party meritocratic system is the best path forward. Zhang argues that without a democratic framework, you literally can't address one of society's deepest problems: the state's unchecked domination over everyday people. He contends that constitutional democracy is absolutely indispensable for limiting authoritarian overreach, even with all its undeniable flaws.
But, and this is where it gets super fascinating, the ancient philosopher Plato would aggressively debunk Zhang's argument. Think about Plato's famous cycle of regimes. It operates kind of like a domino effect. First, an oligarchy creates a massive wealth gap that inevitably leads to democracy, where the masses revolt and seize power. But because ordinary voters, at least in Plato's view, prioritize short-term emotion and absolute freedom over actual wisdom, the democracy just devolves into chaos. And what does that chaos produce? Tyranny. A charismatic demagogue swoops in and seizes absolute control. So Plato would argue that limiting state power isn't the real goal. Justice and harmony are. To him, democracy is inherently doomed from the start.
Moving right along to Section 2, Liberalism versus Democracy, the Arranged Marriage.
We say the phrase liberal democracy all the time, like it's just one word. But historically, it's basically an arranged marriage of two completely different and sometimes deeply conflicting ideas. Let's pull them apart for a second. Democracy asks one main question: who holds power? The answer is the people, the majority, and its core value is equality. If 51% of the people want something, pure democracy gives it to them. Liberalism, on the flip side, asks a totally different question. What are the limits on that power? The answer there is individual rights, and its core value is liberty. Classical liberalism argues there is a sphere of personal life, like property, speech, religion, that no government, not even a democratically elected one, should ever touch.
So, the absolutely crucial point is this: what happens when you have one without the other? Well, you get what is known as an illiberal democracy, or the tyranny of the majority. This is exactly why 18th and 19th century classical liberals were actually terrified of pure democracy. Just imagine a scenario where 90% of the population votes to ban a minority religion, or maybe seize all private property. That is a perfectly democratic outcome because the majority spoke, but it is completely anti-liberal because it blatantly violates individual rights.
The solution to this massive tension was a historical compromise forged over the last 2 centuries. Popular will plus individual rights equals liberal democracy. In this functioning system, the masses elect leaders through free and fair elections representing the popular will. But, and it's a big but, a constitutional wall, like a Bill of Rights or an independent judiciary, acts as a strict liberal constraint. It basically tells the winning majority, hey, congratulations, you won the election, but you still cannot take away basic rights or property. The entire liberal architecture is there specifically to keep the democratic engine from veering off a cliff into mob rule.
Let's look at how this actually plays out in Section 3, the American tug-of-war: history versus rhetoric. The United States is pretty much the quintessential test case for this political marriage. But I want you to think about this number for a second: 6%. Back in 1789, at its inception, the U.S. was highly innovative in its liberal protections, but it was deeply hostile to democracy. The U.S. was an exclusive liberal republic. It had the rule of law and property rights for sure, but the people who actually enjoyed those rights and could vote, they were heavily restricted to white, property-owning males. That was roughly 6% of the population. The system intentionally locked out the masses, legally permitting slavery and the total disenfranchisement of women.
American history definitely hasn't been this steady, easy march forward. It's been a non-linear, incredibly painful struggle to expand the voting base, forcing the democratic reality to finally catch up with the liberal rhetoric. In the 1820s, property requirements were dropped for white men. Post-Civil War, the Reconstruction Amendments theoretically banned racial discrimination in voting, though, as we know, this completely collapsed in the Jim Crow South. In 1920, the 19th Amendment secured women's suffrage. Actually, a lot of political scientists argue that a full, genuine liberal democracy wasn't truly realized in the United States until the Voting Rights Act of 1965 finally dismantled those Jim Crow restrictions.
Which brings us to Section 4, the elite founding ruse, the economics of power.
So, to understand exactly why the American system was originally designed with such severe democratic blind spots, we need to examine a deeper historical critique known as the Beardian thesis. Named after historian Charles A. Beard, this perspective, first argued back in 1913, suggests that the U.S. Constitution wasn't written by flawless demigods solely dedicated to abstract liberty. Instead, Beard proposed it was crafted by a wealthy elite. We're talking merchants, land speculators, plantation owners who were acting out of acute economic self-interest. They were primarily looking to protect their own wealth, land, and power.
Through this very materialist lens, the revolution was largely a brilliant economic maneuver. Step 1. British imperial control through onerous taxes and land blocks threatens colonial wealth. Step 2. Colonial elites need an army, so they brilliantly use universalist rhetoric, phrases like all men are created equal, to mobilize ordinary farmers and laborers. Step 3. Once ties are severed and the war is won, the elites consolidate power in an exclusive republic that explicitly protects private property and locks those ordinary people out of direct power. Under this theory, the universalist language was basically a highly effective mobilization tool.
But here's the incredible historical twist. Even if we completely accept the premise that the founding started as an economic ruse by an elite class, well, ideas have a way of escaping the control of the people who invent them. By putting radical concepts like natural rights and liberty down on paper, the founders accidentally handed a loaded weapon to future generations. Marginalized groups, from women's suffragists to Martin Luther King Jr., they didn't reject the founding documents. Instead, they brilliantly used them as leverage, demanding that the system actually live up to its written promises.
Let's wrap things up with Section 5, Money, Gridlock, and Empire, Modern Geopolitical Realities. Let's bring all of this right into the present day. Remember Plato's 2,400-year-old warning about democracy from the beginning of our explainer? Well, look at how perfectly his symptoms map onto our modern world. Plato warned that late-stage democracy produces leaders who are masters of flattery, actively exploiting social divisions. He warned that a false sense of equality leads to institutional authority and expertise, where uneducated opinions suddenly carry the exact same weight as hard facts. And he warned of hyper-individualism paralyzing the state. When we look at our modern media ecosystems driven by outrage algorithms, it looks exactly like the structural vulnerabilities Plato identified. It's uncanny. And this extreme polarization leads to brutal systemic inefficiency. Look at the pendulum swing here. Party A enacts a 10-year strategic infrastructure plan. Sounds great, right? But then, Party B wins the next 2 to 4 year election cycle simply by campaigning against Party A. So Party B takes power, scraps the projects, and reverses the policy. This means the state spends a tremendous amount of energy just spinning its wheels. While highly centralized systems can often execute multi-decade goals, polarized liberal democracies are frequently structurally trapped in these short-term electoral cycles, totally paralyzing long-term national planning.
Now expand this to the global stage and a pretty cynical geopolitical reality emerges. Major hegemonic powers, historically including nations like the US and Britain, often just bypass international law to protect their global interests. When a foreign government's democratic choices don't align with the hegemon's economic interests, the lofty rhetoric of spreading democracy is frequently dropped. The historical record neutrally shows major powers overthrowing non-compliant democratic leaders, installing and financing puppet dictatorships, and weaponizing financial systems to force compliance. There is a massive gap between the textbook definition of liberal democracy and how power actually operates globally.
Which leaves us with a highly provocative question based on all the philosophy and history we've just covered. Is liberal democracy a realized ideal for justice and harmony, or is it a sophisticated cloaking device for a managed plutocracy? Do the masses truly govern, or do economic elites and imperial interests dictate the reality behind a democratic facade? It's a question that challenges the very foundation of how we view our political reality today, and I'll leave you to chew on that. Thank you so much for joining me on this deep dive in the Explainer, and I highly encourage you to keep questioning the systems around you. Catch you next time.